Funding for Poets and Their Craft on Vermont PBS is provided by Phoenix Books, with stores in Burlington, Rutland, and Essex, Vermont. Phoenix Books, supporting our communities in everything we do, from books to authors. Details and information at phoenixbooks.biz. Vermont College of Fine Arts, located in Montpelier, fosters the excellence of established and emerging writers, designers, artists, composers, teachers, and filmmakers through its graduate-level programs. Learn more at vcfa.edu. Northshire Bookstores, fostering discovery and serendipity for babies to the ageless, committed to building community one book at a time, with locations in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York, and Middlebury Breadloaf School of English and Breadloaf Writers Conferences attract emerging and established faculty, students, and writers from around the country, a summer tradition for more than 90 years.
Hello, I'm Mary Jane Dickerson. Poet and UVM professor David Huddle's works of fiction and nonfiction, with many volumes of poetry, make him one of our most productive contemporary American writers. At the Vermont Bookstore in Middlebury, he brought his unique style of participatory reading to a devoted audience as he took on the topic of formal choice as a path to fresh possibility. But first, here are a few words from Becky Dayton, owner of the bookshop.
I think that poetry is a form of expression. It's been with us for thousands of years. We have poetry in every language, and to me, it's just elemental.
Formal choice often means that the writer chooses a particular form, like a sonnet, or a haiku, or a sestina, or a villanelle. And that's what that's the kind of thing we think of as being formal poetry, received forms like that. But it has come to my attention that all through my life of writing poetry, I've been making formal choices that are just little ones and that are made within the context of free verse. And really it's sort of a decision of where you're going to break a line at a certain place, or whether you're going to use a 3-line stanza and how they might be arranged on the page. Sort of little kinds of things that you make as you're making a poem, but you don't pay much attention to it.
Too many people have thought that what makes poetry be poetry is that it's rhyme and meter, that it's da 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 da, and you have rhymes every other line or rhymes every line. And that's just not what poetry is about. It's a whole other thing. It's a much more complicated, joyful and exuberant kind of activity for both poet and reader.
First book I published, book of poems that I published, was called Paperboy. And I think, I forget when it came out, 78, 76, somewhere in there. But here's a poem from that book. You'll see it's just a little, modest little poem. It's very much a Paperboy poem. Mrs. Green. At the screen door, a pretty woman, just married, and in shorts, on a Saturday in May. She was sweet to me when I came up to collect, offered me something cold to drink, which I refused for the sake of dreaming the whole summer I was 12 about what it would be like some morning to walk softly into that lady's kitchen.
For me, the ideal is to read it to myself, or to have the text in front of me as the poet is reading it aloud, so I get both experiences, hearing it and seeing it. But short of that, I would prefer to hear the poet read it first. And then if I liked it, of course I would go and see if I could find a copy of it and read it on the page. Poets can't help reading their poems in such a way that the poems become more animated than they will to a person just reading it on a piece of paper. But once you've heard a poet read a poem, quite often when you read it on the page, you'll hear it in his voice.
And this is a sequence of poems called Stopping by Home. And it has to do with when I got my job in Vermont, I would drive down to Ivanhoe, Virginia to see my parents, but often I would go on down to North Carolina to Warren Wilson College, where I did some teaching. So quite often I would be stopping by home, going somewhere else, or stopping by home on my way back to Vermont. And during that time, my father was pretty ill. So we're going to read, I think we're going to read probably 3 pages of this. And let me see. Nancy, right? Yeah. Well, you read on page 27 both stanzas of that poem at the top of the page of the 5 times since July.
Okay, start at the beginning of it. 5 times since July, my father has been hospitalized. He's home today, sitting up at his desk in bathrobe, pajamas, slippers. I am embarrassed. I want him fat again, in khakis that smell like sweat, cigarette smoke, carbide, ignoring me because he'd rather work the crossword puzzle alone or pretending to be than risk in those minutes before supper finding out what meanness I've been up to. He's thin now and pale, waiting to hear what's on my mind.
You did such a good job. I want you to go with me next time I've So there's some formal choices here. One of my thoughts about formal choices is that they're just for the writer to help him or her write the poem. So the reader does not have to notice it. It's a device that I use to get my poem written. So in the piece that Nancy just read, there's a rhyme scheme that's completely invisible until I call it to your attention. And now when I call it to your attention, you'll see that it's there. The end words of the first stanza rhyme with the corresponding end word in the second stanza. So that father and rather rhyme, home and alone rhyme, desk and risk rhyme. So I did that in order to give myself some limit, something to push against, some way to focus me into the poem. And that particular stanza, form and rhyme, exists throughout this this whole poem. Janet, will you read the third one, please?
They say his hair turned white. It's true, it's grayer than it was, almost white. He can't read much now, has no power of concentration. Mind strays. Today he talks about friends who've died, relatives long gone. In a photograph he points out which ones are dead now. But you, and Lester Waller, and Tom Pope, and George Scriber, and James Payne, so many still alive, I remind him. He seems not to hear and bends to put the picture away. Some still around, he says. Yes, no doubt.
I should say that during this time, I'm sure my father was having a hard time with it, and my mother was having a hard time with it, and I was having a hard time with it. But when I have a hard time emotionally, I don't show it, and to sort of keep my wits about me. So when I'm writing about it is when I kind of work through what I need to work through. Rachel, let's try with you. And you and I will trade stanzas. Say, for instance, I'll get you to read the first stanza, I'll read the second, you read the third, and so on like that. And we'll see how long we can make it work. With this one, a form evolved in the writing of it that meant the same stanza repeats itself. It's a 2-syllable line, a 5-syllable line, a 10-syllable line, a 5-syllable line, a 2-syllable line. So that there's this kind of starting out small, expanding, shrinking, small, expanding. And this is really about my father's death, which occurred while I was here in Vermont. And so my way of knowing about it had to be from what people told me through the time of going there for the funeral and so on. But it also meant that I had to imagine, make up a lot of it, because I wasn't there. There is something about a death of a family member that requires us to take hold of it, to sort of fix it in some kind of way so that we can carry it with us and go on from that. And the poem is the way I go about that. So, Rachel, will you start?
The phone woke her, and she knew instantly, Mother said. A nurse said he seemed to be, there is no word.
That suits what was happening to him in those early mornings, and I don't know what they said.
Really, he seemed to be dying. I will say here instead of the going that first came to mind, they said
he was dying. My mother heard that word singing through the telephone, and it must have been the sound
she heard, whispered in her dreams. She got up quickly, dressed, made herself think of everything, stepped out,
and turned to lock the door. When she realized it wasn't just dark out there, there was a fog so thick.
The end of the lighted porch was invisible to her, but she kept going. She walked on out
toward the garage, her hand outstretched, touching nothing. The light behind her diminished now. She took
2 more steps, and the planet dropped away from her. She couldn't even see her feet. I am, she thought,
going to the hospital to be with my husband who was dying. She took 1 more step and closed
her eyes, and it was the same darkness either way. Eyes closed, eyes open. She thought it harder this time.
I am going. She turned back, and in 4 steps she could see the porch light. She went in and made coffee
and sat down at the table with the empty cup in front of her. She lost track of time. She sat there.
And I was asleep beside my wife here in Vermont. Charles was asleep in Rhode Island. Bill asleep
out west, all the grandchildren sleeping. The 97-year-old mother in the nursing home asleep.
But he was not alone. There were nurses. Dr. Rhoda walked up there to the hospital knowing
a man he'd kept alive was going to, did those people have the right word? Did they say he's going
to die? Do I know? If they'd say that, I have to see them there beside his bed, 3 of them watching
him breathe, taking his pulse, then catching each other's eyes when there was no more breath, no more pulse, no more
life. What words were spoken then when they had to turn away from what they had witnessed? I want their words to be common. Do you want some coffee? Is it still foggy out there? Even I've got to take a
piss. I want them to be who they are. My mother in the car, later making her way there to be
who she is. My brothers, my children, my nieces and nephews, even old deaf grandmama. I want
no one ever again like Mother to have to grope out into that complete darkness where it
didn't matter if she was alive or dead. For that moment she was not anywhere and did not matter.
He was. I say my father was here. I say he lived thousands of strong days. I know he got sick. My father
died. I can say that. Can walk from home to work, can touch my daughter's hair, can say anything I want. And you see what I mean by formal decision. The formal decision of that syllable that shrinks and expands and shrinks and expands is the only way I could have written that poem. And it, I think of it a little bit as the accompaniment for a jazz musician who's improvising, whereas the accompaniment is often just a steady rhythm or maybe some chord changes and stuff like that, whereas the improviser is weaving all this kind of the story of a thing with his music. So it serves that function of something steady and solid underneath a line that can meander all over the place. There's something about death that you need to take hold of it. You need to sort of make it your own. So that poem I think that I read about my father was really one of imagining the details of his death so that I could actually take a hold of it and make it mine. When I came back from Vietnam, I had
some things that I had seen and done that I needed to deal with, and I wrote poems and stories about them. And I think I was able to sort of work my way through that material so that it didn't stay in my brain and make me obsess about it, but so that I could sort of put it behind me and go on with my life.
So in the process of writing, at what point does the form come in? I mean, do you say, oh, I'm going to write this poem that I'm going to go 2, 5, 10?
You know the answer to that.
I'm just asking.
Well,
Those things, it's funny, and this is really the adventure of it. As you're writing it, you figure out what the form is, and then the form helps you figure out what the poem is, and then the poem, it's sort of, they play against each other. And after a while, you feel almost like you could step back and say, well, you all just keep talking to yourself here. The form and the line, you all can do this, which is a good thing to happen.
I have a very particular version of inspiration, and it's when I'm writing something, and write a sentence and maybe put a period, and then I need to write another sentence, and I might think, well, I know what sentence I want to write next, but all of a sudden something comes to me that says, here's something that could go here. So for me, it always occurs when I am already writing, when I'm working on something that has me so deeply engaged that ideas, lucky ideas, whatever, jolts of lightning from my subconscious that comes to me that I didn't have before I sat down. The idea of seeing a sunset and being inspired and then going home and writing about it is foolish to me. I might sit down to write about a sunset, and after I got, say, 3 lines into it, I might come to some piece of language or some notion about time and light and stars and so on. Then that would be inspiration that came to me when I started with a sunset. But I don't think inspiration is for me anywhere other than in the act of writing.
April Saturday, 1960.
I mean, Berkeley Osborne and I had small interest in each other. And it was happenstance the afternoon we found ourselves in the ballroom of Wytheville Country Club, nobody else around except Judy and Bobby, her cousin and my pal, so serious a couple they lost interest in us immediately, put on a slow record and stepped out on the dance floor to do something that could hardly be called a dance.
Ginger, will you take it from there and read till you get to a period?
An undulating embrace was what it was. Berkeley and I, joking, started a mannerly box step.
And, sir, would you go on?
We'd spoken hardly 10 sentences before. Maybe I grinned at her one day in the hall, or she at me in band practice or history, but we'd never touched fingertips, let alone tried to dance.
And you, sir, will you read a sentence?
So it's no wonder we began in awkwardness and humor, poking fun at the kiss. Bobby and Judy showed no signs of breaking off.
And will you read 2 sentences?
It's strange enough, 2 couples dancing in a ballroom with all the invisible chaperones.
Tisk-tisking.
Tisk-tisking. The other dancers not yet having arrived. Full daylight, reflecting over the parquet floor. A line of chairs for wallflowers along 3 walls. Tables whitely waiting for punch bowls perfectly centered among cups. Small plates for cookies, party napkins placed exactly so. Music stands awaited, saxman, trumpeter, and trombonist. The discreet piano widely grinned, and the drums and cymbals yearned to be punished. Meanwhile, Berkeley and I box-stepped, our laps nicely around the ballroom.
And you, sir, would you read? Sure. Maybe 2 sentences. Let's see what 2 you get.
Oh, my God, whispered Berkeley. She gave a nod toward Bobby and Judy, only their pelvises moving, his hands on her butt and hers on his. They stood in place, clothes on, a very good boy and girl, except for movements of their tongues, hips, and hands.
The record that kept on repeating was the soulful, unchained melody, which cast a spell over the whole room. It was like a space capsule floating endlessly toward unknown galaxies of eternal mid-afternoon light, with Berkeley and me in orbit around a red-hot Bobby Judy planet. Well, the box step grows tiresome after you step out box number 1004. Berkeley and I shifted in position. She gave a sigh, then snuggled in close. We still had our clothes on, and we didn't collapse to the floor. The event was so mental and over so quickly that the annals of sexual history don't even mention it. All right, maybe it was no more than a tight embrace with a remarkably intense kiss, and maybe the body movements of accomplished lovers like Bobby and Judy. Maybe a favorite hobby of theirs was leading mere casual friends into situations of carnal possibility. Berkeley and I locked into each other, parts of a clock, moving perfectly moving, fitting perfectly, moving in time. And would you, ma'am, please pick it up from there?
We were just kids, really, 16 and 17. We hadn't much experience, certainly not of such intensity or strangeness. I think Eros looked at Cupid and gave a wink, and suddenly Berkeley sighed, "Oh," which took me over the edge. "Oh," I said, too. We just stood there, breathing and shuddering together.
Maybe another sentence.
Embarrassment set in very quickly, but it was of the bonding variety, and of course we couldn't go back to the box step. We tried to chat and stand where we were, our arms still around each other, our aims a bit vague and sentimental.
Would you?
How kind words were to come to us now that we have learned such a lesson of recapitulating ontology, human folly, and the utter indifference of stars drifting through silence.
And another sentence, please, sir.
I have to go to tuck my shirt in, or I should splash cold water on my face, or shouldn't we get out of here? Or exact words aren't the point.
At a certain emotional pitch, the tone of a voice is all that matters. Somebody just croon to me, please, and I'll be okay soon. 10,000 days have flown away since that small piece of a sunny afternoon. Berkeley's had her life, I've had mine, and who can say if what happened made any difference to either of us? Her remembrance may bring her a twitch of a smile, but that's all. Sometimes I feel I'm a sliver of dust in the great pattern of creation. I think fate is a vast intelligence, but then I recall blips of cosmic nonsense, like that afternoon with Berkeley. Galactic energy started crackling along the stratospheric periphery, with Darwin and Freud spastically heaving in their graves, and a boy and a girl in a Virginia town, by the whimsy of chaos, the theology of random chance, were flung body against body. Bless their hearts, they played their ludicrous parts, saying, "Oh," and standing in place with astonishing kindness and grace. So you can see that poem went on, and the secret about that is I couldn't get the damn thing stopped. So it had to keep going till I got it stopped.
A poem is really good if you read it and you don't want to throw it away. You want to read it again, or you want to set it aside so I read it again, or you want to give it to somebody. And so I think that too is a need, to have something almost like music. If there's a song that you know you want to hear for the rest of your life, every now and then a poem can be like that.
Ms. Hicks is a I was going to say she's a character, but she's beyond a character. She's sort of my imaginative relative. Ms. Hicks realizes effigies please her, though their art or lack of art doesn't much matter. It's their stoniness she likes, granite or marble. She prefers heroic athletes, males with rounded buttocks, worthy of Percheron's female sweeties, who modestly cover virginal breasts and nether regions, or perhaps posed as archers. But Ms. Hicks turns ecstatically silly when she encounters stone alligators, turtles, or even bunnies. She has been heard confiding in them or beseeching whatever deity it is that looks over them, "Oh, please let me be one of you. Make my next life be brainless, and still give me a garden fountain, old trees, shade, some grass, and a very few visitors to smile at me before going somewhere else." She's not very friendly, Miss Hicks is not. And I had a really great English teacher in high school who taught me how to diagram sentences, taught me punctuation, taught me parts of speech, all of that stuff. So I know better than to write like this, where I jam sentences together and use no punctuation and all of that. And I do it, well, in part because she's dead, so she can't come and get me now. So, but also, I think, at least what I aspire to here, is something that's very close to gibberish, but that nevertheless makes sense. And I want to push the language to do that it makes this kind of ratchet, rattle sound, but that it actually tells some kind of narrative that is readable and comprehensible. You all have been a great audience. Thank you so much. Poetry matters because many people need it, and they may spend half a lifetime not knowing they need it, and all of a sudden read a poem and say, wow, I sure am glad I read that. Many of us need a regular diet of it. I mean, for me, it is a way of, it's almost a way of thinking about the world that's not the television news, not the newspaper news, not the radio news. It's a way of taking in a voice that the world seems to speak to us that's deeper, more intimate, and more lasting, I guess, than I think about the other sources being.